Right, hello, greetings. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern. It's my weekly fasting Sunday. These began 2 years ago to stop Brexit. Nice to see somebody got an MBE who leads the Brexit resistance from Spain. She wrote a very witty letter accepting it, but also saying, like, come on, you've got to be joking. So kudos to her. Most of the people that got their awards were all, Brexit, activists, which is, to me, shocking. And, obviously I'm speaking here from France. I'm a European, a Europhile, a Francophile, an internationalist, a lover of the whole world, a lover of the wisdom of each European culture and nation, including Britain, but including all its sub-regions, it's Cornwall's. I've lived in Wales for 10 years, I've lived in Scotland for 7 years, and I run the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, so, Brexit is the worst ever nightmare, and I noted yesterday with glee that Nigel Nicks, I think is what it's called, the guy behind Cambridge Analytica, who was a nightmare boss to poor old Chris Wylie, my fellow Canadian, hello Chris, hope they let you watch this, has finally been blacklisted by the British, investigative body that investigates companies, and he's been convicted of illegal business practice, unethical business practice, including a load of horror stuff. Read it, it's on the Gov website, I mean, this is official, and this guy was the guy that sold us Brexit. I mean, the guy's a criminal, and even an unethical businessman, as if we didn't know from reading Chris Wylie's biography, but or his account of how that company, Cambridge Analytica, scammed the British people into doing Brexit. Now, what's so extraordinary is that, okay, now that comes out, it's 2021, the election was 2016, the referendum, and of course there's no repercussions. I mean, this is one of the things, I have a complaint to make to God, actually. I'm going to make a complaint to Ahura Mazda or Yahweh or whatever you want to call yourself, Mr. God, that you allow knowledge to drip out so slowly. And most people are like budgerigars kept in a cage and haven't got a clue what's going on. You just drip feed us with bits of knowledge. And for all our internets and our wonderful publishing industries and our advanced academia and so on, knowledge is always too late to get to the people, and it's controlled and it's policed and it's filtered through the corporate, international, military, capitalist sector, which has been going on ever since Marx began to wake up to this fact in the mid-19th century and said, hey, what's this capitalism thing? What's it doing? The trouble is Marx didn't live long enough to really carry through on his brilliant analysis. He got diverted into all kinds of stuff. And he never finished the volume that would have looked at the role of capital in militarism. Who could afford to go to World War I or do the Bismarckian German Empire? It was the capitalist industries who made those wars possible by investing in huge military tech that made the big guns possible. I mean, the German army, when it invaded Paris in 1870, they had a big gun that could fire 60 miles. It was vast. I mean, it was 100 feet long or 100 yards long, and it had to be carried on a train. And then it was parked 60 miles from Paris, and it could fire shells into the city. And that was in 1870. Now that's when I'm talking about the technological link between capital investment, capital overconcentration in a few hands, and then militarism. Who wanted that war? Well, they were the military financiers who were investing in building those armaments. Poor old French didn't know what hit them, really. The French, for all their bravado and their Napoleonic stuff, they're not really warrior types. I mean, I know them. They're my local villagers. I'm reading a book about the history of La Creuse, a little village called Chassignon, which is very similar to my Batet. A nice British person settled there and wrote up the whole history of it based on the libraries of La Châtre. And, these are peasants who just are very happy to get on with their milking the cows and growing the crops in the fields and having a happy life and getting married and having barn dances and And it's fascinating, and yet occasionally they're called off to war, and they haven't got a clue why or what it's for, and they're against it instinctively. The French are against war, which is why there has been a long pacifist movement in the history of France. So that's where I'm speaking from. That's why I'm against Brexit, because it, to me, is the latest in their military capitalist coups. And it doesn't look like a war, but it is. It's an intellectual war and it's a cultural war. And the people behind it, the Nigel Nixes, I'm afraid, are the antagonists. They took the British people by surprise, utterly, and played us. And I'm part of the resistance. So, no, I don't have an MB to celebrate. I'm not sure I'd even accept it if it was offered. I mean, I no longer believe in the Westminster, Whitehall, Windsor model of governance, which thinks it has the right to rule over the entire British Isles. Ireland doesn't matter. The fact that Ireland voted against Brexit, well, irrelevant, Boris Johnson did not grow up in London and Britain like I did, which was subject to the troubles in Ireland, the bombings. I was in my office in Kingsley Hall teaching a class on peace studies in the building where Gandhi lived when he came to London in the 1930s. I ran the School of Non-Violence from there. The windows rattled when the huge bomb went off in Canary Wharf. I was involved in peacemaking behind the scenes, which made the Good Friday Peace Agreement possible. I've been close friends with Peter Cadogan, who was an activist for peace. We ran meetings on philosophers for peace, looking at Ireland, including in Parliament. Now, Boris Johnson wasn't even, his kind were not even, out of their nappies, with all due respect, intellectually speaking. I'm not sure he is still. Only people that don't understand how deep that conflict was and who have no knowledge of Irish culture and history could think that Brexit is a good idea. And that means Priti Patel, she hasn't got a clue what Ireland stands for. She says, oh, famine? No, why don't they have another famine then? These people are arrogant beyond belief. She's also a chum of Netanyahu, who's going down during this week, thank God, and hopefully will be in prison by next week. These are very evil people. They're very blinkered and they're very, right-wing in that ignorant sense of, it's my country, my vision, me, Priti Patel. It's egotism translated into politics. And what it's premised on is this being against the left. That's what Trump says if you, listen to his speeches. Everything is a whip-up of hatred against the left. As if they know what the left is. I mean, these are terms that were invented in Paris during the cataclysmic epoch of the revolution, when the peasants said they'd had enough of these elitist types running their country, and they wanted to change. And at first it was going to be a moderate change, and it went through some hiccups, and it basically was a moderate change. They wanted a republic. Some people fought back and wanted to get rid of the revolution, and so they, unfortunately, there was fighting. There was a conflict. Robespierre became the kind of sword arm of the republic. I don't agree with that, but you can understand why the revolutionaries did what they did. But the left, the genuine left, was with people like Nicholas Bonville, who was a great intellectual, friend of William Blake and Thomas Paine. And I note that Peru has now shifted to the left. We have now a Prime Minister being elected who is going to be upholding the high ethical standards of trying to advance the whole of society, not just your elite, your class, your interests. I mean, the whole notion of left-right is actually a misnaming of what goes on in world politics. It's a binary choice, whereas in fact we should be thinking more in terms of levels of inclusiveness. People are more holistic and think about everybody, or they're more exclusive and they think about just their little class of chums. Boris Johnson is one of those exclusivist types who thinks about his fellow Etonians and hasn't got a clue what the people of Ireland actually think or care about, or the people of Scotland. Well, I've done walkabout. I'm speaking on behalf of the entire British and Irish Isles, as they are, and saying Brexit is a nightmare. And I'm also the peace druid of the British Isles, so I speak on behalf of the indigenous community of priests and sages who for 10,000 years have celebrated freedom of movement. The Druids had freedom of movement anywhere in Europe. They travelled down to Greece. We went to Egypt. We were the learned classes of northwestern Europe. And I've written an Encyclopedia of Druid Studies explaining all this in detail. It's only just now really being discovered, because the Roman Empire, run by crooks and gangsters, tried to erode and destroy a lot of that ancient wisdom, but failed. And it's interesting that most of the great European cities today, like Strasbourg, are on original Celtic foundations. Paris is another. These are Druid centres, as I'm speaking from here. Right, so anyway, there we are. Nigel Nicks, he should be in prison. It's not enough to bar him from running companies. He should actually go to jail. And I hope that the Crown Prosecution Service will, finally pull their finger out. Right, I have a friend that used to be a judge in the Crown Prosecution Service, and Keir Starmer used to be its head. Who's on the job now? Who's taken over Keir Starmer's job? They're sleeping on the job. These Nigel Nickses need to be in prison. They've scammed and polluted, the waterways of politics. It's great being for Save the Whale, greening the planet and all that, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, but and making the Thames run clear and we can have goldfish swimming about. Fine, I'm all for that. But what if the arteries of the body politic, what if the thinking of our politicians become polluted and clogged with lies, disinformation, and erroneous and false axioms? Brexit was fought on erroneous and false axioms, deluding the people. And that's polluted the body politic of my country irreparably until it's reversed. And I will be going on fasting until it's reversed. And if that requires the breakup of the UK and the separate identity of Scotland being reasserted and the whole of Ireland being reasserted, then so be it. That is going to be the necessary price to pay for enlightenment. When enlightenment happens, the ego has to go. As anyone that's been on the spiritual path for any length of time will tell you. And that's, the point of all the spiritual teachings of humanity. And when ego goes, it literally has to change, die. So the ego that is the UK, this collective ego thing that does the British Empire and, did Rorke's Drift and the Charge of the Light Brigade, all this stuff that I was brought up to think was a good thing. Well, no, it wasn't. It was militarism, and it was in the service, like little mercenaries, of the growing powers of capitalism. And it was a bad thing. And it first whet its sword arm against the Irish and against the Scots and in the clearances, which were capitalism evicting the peasants off their crofts in Scotland and putting sheep there. Marx actually has a lot of stuff about Scottish and Irish dimensions of the advent of capitalism. As I say, it's brilliant stuff, but he leaves out the military aspects of capitalism. That was going to be his fourth volume. He didn't live long enough. He did come here to France with his daughter Eleanor, the one he was closest to, on holiday. They went to Pau, which is a beautiful town in the Haut-Pyrénées, down the road from here. So he at least had a nice holiday in France. The Marx family were Francophiles. My mother was a Francophile Marxist, and her house was filled with, Sidney Bechet and great French singers, composers, and poets. And she was a French teacher and did a French degree at the University of London. I was grown up as a Francophile, and we used to come to France 2 weeks every year without fail as a family. And they're some of my most precious memories, Juan Lepin down on the Côte d'Azur, paradise. And looking out at the Ile de l'Airain, where many of the greatest Christian mystics of Europe were trained, including St. Patrick, who took Christianity to Ireland. Coming here every 2 weeks for my formative years was like an education in sophistication. I realised these French are incredibly amazing, cultured, intelligent and wonderful people. Why wouldn't we want to be allied with them? Why wouldn't we want them to be our best friends and lovers? Well, precisely. And yet Brexit has now cut a wall through that, imposed by a man that has no British identity or culture. He was not a proper British citizen ever. He just happens to have a passport through a fluke. Actually, he's an American citizen. He thinks like an American. And his whole thought world is American, which is why he's selling off the NHS to American corporations. You know, we have to stop this person and this madness. And if you have ideas, you know, I mean, I suggest you fast once a week. It's a sign of, I'm serious about this. That's what Gandhi said. His disciples, the Satyagrahis, have to do fasting. That's why Jesus used fasting, and it's why Muhammad did. If you're serious about spiritual work, do a weekly fast and get in touch. Right, now that's my little Brexit slot. I'm going to move on and talk about something a bit more happy, because how are we going to do it? Well, we have to marshal the saints and sages of all the ages. Here is my calendar, Universal Calendar of Saints and Sages, which I authored when I was teaching full-time. I used to come home at the weekends, teaching full-time in secondary schools doing religious education. And I learned that very few children know much about any religions, even Christianity, which is supposedly the religion of the majority of people in Britain. Complete, you know, ignorance about most of them. So, but they quite like the idea of the saints of the day. I used to do this little exercise in the classroom, writing up, you know, today's St. Thomas Aquinas' day, and then we'd learn a bit about him, where he came from. So you'd learn a bit about history, geography, spirituality, intellectual stuff, you know. So I thought, why don't we have a book of saints of all the religions? Because a lot of the kids I was teaching were not Christian, but many were from Muslim backgrounds, Sikh, Hindu, Jewish, etc. in today's multicultural Britain, which I love. So I said, okay, let's have a multicultural dictionary of all the saints and sages, of all humanity, of all faiths. And I looked around, there wasn't one in the shops, so I wrote it. You know, it's 500 pages. And it's useful every day of the week. You then have 13 sages. And you can, like, honour their memory. It's a sort of spiritual practice to honour their memory. If you're with a group, if you live in a little community, you can have a study hour where each person represents one of them to the group. And, you know, that's a discipline in itself. I'm a jnana yogi, so I practice intellectual yoga, and that's the point of it. Okay, I want to summarise just a few of the ones today, because they're so interesting, I had to share these. Today we have Honor Grimaldi, 1758 to 1819, who was a Freemason, and was the prince or king of Monaco in the southern part of France, along the Côte d'Azur there. It's a separate little principality, a kingdom in fact. And some of you know, others don't know, I've been agitating, if that's the right word, to get the monarchs of the world to make a council, to have a council of monarchs. I think it would be very good. They could do education, charity, fundraising, environmental work, you know, mediation, etc. And nobody's thought of this. There's never been in the history of humanity a council of monarchs, and yet there's 34 of them still reigning, including in Britain, in Spain, in Belgium, in Holland, and Norway and Sweden and so on. There are many monarchs in Europe. They're also, and they're normally, well, they're all constitutional monarchs. They do their bit, they're the figurehead, but they don't involve themselves in, politics. I think the problem with the current Queen is she hasn't read her, she needs a constitutional upgrade. I'm a great supporter of the monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy. We need an upgrade, because what she's been doing, she's been very badly advised over Brexit. She took it that she couldn't interfere in that election and say boo to a goose over it, let it go through. So she was completely silent, mum, during Brexit. Now I think that was a catastrophic error. But now they're speaking out about, oh, Scotland doesn't have the right to a second independence referendum. No, Scotland is a part of the UK, don't let it go. What they haven't realised is by being silent about Brexit, they've made it inevitable that Scotland will leave the UK. Now they can try and game that. They can use all their intelligence agents and try and block the Scottish independence, as they're doing, and they can silence the Scottish independence movement, but they won't succeed. It's so obvious that it's a Windsor, Westminster, Whitehall monster. So, yeah, badly advised, and therefore we need a written constitution in the UK to stop that kind of thing. The Queen should have this, that and the other duty, that's it, end of story. The Privy Council, where a lot of this stuff is cooked up, that should be televised and publicised and open to freedom of information requests. This would be a constitutional reform. It grows out of the 1832 liberal constitutional reform. I'm very disappointed in Wordsworth in that he disapproved of the liberal revolution of 1832. I think it shows the limitations of Wordsworth. Although my daughter is doing a PhD on him, I think it's very sad. I hope she points out his false thinking over the idea that Tory repression is the way to make human beings better. What? I mean, no wonder his poetry went downhill and he wrote just sort of banal doggerel. I'm with Keats and Shelley and the real poets of that era, and Blake. So anyway, Grimaldi. Thank you, Monaco. Then we have, for esoteric thinkers, we have Edward Lloyd, 1660 to 1709. The first keeper of the Ashmolean Museum and a pioneering Celticist and philologist. Now, when I'm speaking this Sunday, we have the people meeting in Cornwall, these G7 so-called. The Cornish don't want Brexit. They voted, as consistently, they were benefiting from the European Union. And any true-blooded Cornishman is appalled at Brexit. And I noted with great glee there was a huge yellow banner erected about Brexit, opposing it for these delegates to see as they flew in. I know Cornwall very well. I've spent many, many happy summers there in my youth. And it's one of the mystical lost landscapes of Britain. And so Edward Lloyd was the first comparative Celtic scholar. He went to Cornwall, he travelled about, he interviewed, he talked to people when Cornish was a living language. He came to Brittany, here in France, spoke to Bretons, met scholars and savants, learned Breton, wrote it down. He went to Scotland, met the Gaels, spoke Gaelish, learned their words. He was like me, carried a dictionary, in his pocket to jot down all the words he was learning. He then went to Ireland and he learned Irish. He studied with the Irish Druids, etc., who taught him Gaelic, and also in Welsh, which was his native language, Lloyd. And so he then went back to Oxford, put all these together in a huge dictionary of comparative Celtic languages. Nobody had done it before. And he argued that they all are from the same root, and that they have two different types, the P Celts and the Q Celts. And he was the first guy to make that distinction, and he speculated a lot. He also wrote about Celtic mythology, Druidry, science, and innumerable other subjects. I mean, he was a real savant. The Ashmolean Museum where he worked was is one of the great intellectual centres of Britain. And Elias Ashmole, after whom it's named, who founded it, was a Freemason, wrote the history of the Order of the Garter. Don't forget, I taught at Oxford, so I'm a bit biased. The Ashmolean, not the Fitzwilliam, is the place for me. And in fact, I've written a play which the first scene opens in the Ashmolean, called The Memory of Light, which I hope some enterprising theatre company will perform. So anyway, Edward Lloyd, we take our hat off to you and thank you for all your amazing work as a scholar. I have a huge entry on him in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, obviously, because he's a pioneer. And there ought to be a chair of Druid Studies at Oxford, by the way. Hint, hint. Okay, then we move on and we come to Jikigyo Ito, an 18th century Shinto mountain saint. Now, as you know, I have a soft spot for the Shintos. They're like the Druids of Japan. They're amazing. And these Shinto saints, I mean, they went up top of the mountain, built a little retreat, studied Taoism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and just got high on knowledge and doing their daily prayers to the gods, who are the kami, who surround us all the time. You know, the Druids worship the kami, the Hindus do. Every indigenous culture knows that every sacred space has its kami. And the Japanese have been at this for ever since they were in, you know, first came into being. And the Japanese know they descended from the gods. Well, don't we all? I mean, isn't this common knowledge? When I went to see some Druid friends in Ireland once, they pointed to a mountain and said, that's where the gods descended, and that's where we are descended from. You know, of course we're descended from the gods. Anyway, greetings to you, Jikyo Ito, 18th century mountain Shinto saint. We have Joseph Levinson for the Jewish people and religion. He was actually a historian of China and Confucian thought. A great Jewish intellectual, died in 1969. And then we come to Abu Bakr for Islam, who died in 635 and who inherited from Muhammad the governorship of the early Islamic community. And this was not an easy job. He was the first caliph elected after the death of Muhammad. He was from a rich background. And he was a great, you know, supporter of Muhammad. And his daughter, Aisha, was Muhammad's last wife and very beloved wife. Abu Bakr was an interesting man. He was known for his art of interpreting dreams. The Meccans often turned to him. His real name was Abd Allah Abu Bakr, which means the father of the maiden, you know, which perhaps refers to Aisha. He and the Prophet hid in a cave in Mount Thawr when they'd escaped from Mecca. I mean, he was the guy chosen to go with Muhammad when they escaped late at night, and the Meccans by now were trying to come and kill them. They got out just in time and hid in a cave up in the mountain. And a spider built a web across the cave. So although the search party found the cave, they saw it was covered with the spider's web and decided it wasn't worth going in. They can't be there because, look, there's a spider's web. Well, unknown to them, the Prophet and Abu Bakr were hiding in the cave. And, you know, I mean, if they'd have come in there, they would have probably killed them both, almost certainly. And that would be it. So I think we owe Abu Bakr a great deal. And he, unfortunately, only lived to be 2 years in his caliphate. But he, you know, he was a close friend and trusted confidant of Muhammad and the father of Aisha, so we honour and respect his memory today. And even those of us that think that Ali would have made a better second, you know, a better first caliph, I don't think you can grumble too much at Abu Bakr. He was himself a great man. He was known as the As-Sadiq, the faithful one, and he was leading the faithful in prayers when Muhammad was facing his final illness. And maybe he stands for the people of wealth, you know, who can give their wealth to good causes. There are good wealthy people on the planet. There are good merchants, good bankers. I've met some of them, you know. Just because you're rich doesn't make you evil. There are good people of wealth who use their wealth wisely. And at least Muhammad had a few of them in his party, or we'd never have heard of him. Then we come to a scholar, and who is the great Max Muller, 1823 to 1900, who edited the Sacred Books of the East, a 51-volume series, between 1879 and 1910. Now, Max Muller and me go back a long way. When I was a young man in my early 20s, I spent 3 years studying all world religions and philosophies at the University of Calgary. It was like, you know, paradise to me. And they had the complete Sacred Books of the East. And I would take out a different volume each week and read it right through with footnotes and everything. That's how I first studied the Quran, the Jain scriptures, the Buddhist sutras, the Hindu, in absolute detail. you know. And I would allow myself several weeks to master each text, and in the case of the Quran, several months. And I designed a really complex, like a synopsis, a curricula to study all world religions. Having resigned from the University of Bristol's philosophy department, when I realised it was just a narrow propaganda unit for materialism, and it was a fake philosophy department. I hope it's better now. You know, in those days it was a nightmare. So I had to go and study alone, and I did that at this world, you know, period of 4 years actually in Canada. And Max Muller was like my bedside companion. Then I went to London. I, you know, did a secondary in history, and kept falling back on Max Muller when I was starting to teach. I was teaching religious studies through Lord Combermere at Birkbeck College for, you know, 8-9 years, and I gave lectures at Birkbeck College, where E.F. Shoemaker used to teach as well. It's a great college, part of the University of London, whilst I was pursuing my PhD. And it was those deep sittings at the feet of Max Muller that enabled me to give that sort of all-encompassing approach to religious studies, which I've always cultivated. Once you've read the sacred books of the East, you can't be a small-minded thinker. You can't be a narrow-minded thinker. It's just not possible. To me, it should be compulsory reading for every philosophy graduate in every country in the world, including Britain, which is probably the smallest, meanest-minded of all philosophy traditions, because they sort of exercise anyone that thinks, you know, big, like Hegel. I mean, they're just like verboten. They're Europeans, right? Hegel was someone who was the equivalent of Max Muller in his own intellectual sphere. It's not surprising Max Muller was German. He was trained in the German academic system, and then he got the chair at Oxford. Now, he was friends. Okay, so that's my London days teaching, and I did my PhD at that point. And then I eventually, long story, you know, when I was teaching religious studies, that's why I devised my periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies, which you've seen. I've got, you know, it's like a Mendeleev's table, but each religion and philosophy, including the obscure ones, are all noted there. That was inspired by Max Muller's holistic approach. Then I went up. I was offered a castle in southwest of Scotland, in Argyll, in the foot of the Highlands. I went up there and lived there for 7 years in paradise, teaching, writing. You know, I wrote some of my most important books up there. And I discovered, lo and behold, that castle was very close to Inverary Castle, where the Duke of Argyll and his family had been living for centuries. And in the 19th century, the Duke of Argyll had been a friend of two people. Max Muller was a correspondent of the then Duke of Argyll, who was an intellectual who opposed Darwin's narrow materialist interpretation of evolution. He said, no, Darwin, it's not possible that we, human beings, souls, spirits, angels, we can't all have descended, you know, in the way you describe in the natural selection theory. He said there's got to be something more. And he wrote some very learned treatises about this, which I discovered. I have copies of. One of them is called The Unity of Nature, which is very interesting. And the Duke of Argyll was also friends, not just with Max Muller, who he was corresponding with all the time, but also with a chap called Bunsen, who was the then German ambassador in London, and who was a clever guy, very clever guy. He was an intellectual, essentially. He wrote books about Egyptology and early Christianity. He said, interesting, all this Egyptological stuff in the Bible, maybe we ought to go and study it. And he helped sponsor and support German expeditions down the Nile to find the